So what I'm actually going to talk to you about is a bit about veteranization. You've heard that word being used several times, and this is something that's very close to my heart. It's something that I started doing almost, not quite, 25 years ago. And I think, as we say in English, it was something that we did on the back of a fag packet. Does that make any sense to any of you? It means it wasn't very well planned. It was sitting whilst we were having a cup of coffee thinking, we're clearing trees around other old trees. If we don't take them away and we just damage them a bit, maybe that might be quite good for biodiversity. And that's kind of where some of the work we did started. But it meant that it wasn't very, we didn't do a lot of monitoring on it. On the other hand, I did keep very detailed records of the work that we did back in the late 90s, but they were all destroyed in a flood. So that was a bit depressing. But anyway, so that's really, veteranization is what I'm going to talk to you briefly about this afternoon. And I'm going to talk to you not so much about what's happened in Bridging the Gap, but about some other studies that have been done in Sweden and some of the results that we've got. So very briefly, what is it? Well, it's a nature conservation tool. It's another tool in our toolbox, creating decaying wood habitats on live, younger trees, mimicking what happens in nature. Never on our already interesting old trees. Never, ever, ever. Not even on the trees that might even be thinking about becoming interesting in the near future. And mimicking nature. I love this photograph. It's my neighbour, who's a wildlife photographer, that he took it, and he didn't really think this was a particularly interesting photograph until I saw it. This is brilliant. This is like an arborist with climbing spikes. And he was like, what are you talking about, Vikki? And I said, can I borrow your picture? Yeah, of course you can. So, it's using nature, it's looking at nature, it's lightning strikes, it's storm damage, it's animal damage. You just have to go into any town and you see a lot of very excellent examples of tree damage and habitat creation for all sorts of reasons. And in fact, a forester once said to me he thought he'd spent his life veteranizing trees because he was using forest harvesters in woodland situations. Anyway. Now, everybody's been talking about this already, about why we need to veteranize. So I feel like in this audience, we don't really need to say very much about this. I'd just like to add in things like tree diseases, tree mortality, and that's one of the most powerful tools that I've had as a nature conservationist, is actually, drawing a graph on a piece of paper that if you have 1,000 old trees and only have 1% mortality, it's about 150 years and you'll be down at 100 trees. So we don't have the time to sit on our laurels. We don't have the time to do nothing. And that's often a question that I've had. And I've guessed had hostility about the idea of damaging trees, particularly from arborists, people who spend their lives caring for trees, that what are you talking about? You're going to damage trees instead. But actually, when you think about it, we've done forestry and agriculture, we've taken away a lot of trees, and what have we got to lose? This picture you've seen already, but it's the generation gap. The other question I often get is, where is it appropriate and how do we do it? Well, I think you've seen examples. We've got wood pastures that have become overgrown. We've got trees that we need to remove anyway. So it's a no-brainer, really. That we're looking, you remove some trees, you can veteranize some trees, you can kill some trees, and you get this slow process of clearing around the old trees, but in one operation. And that's often a common problem we have. We've got the money now, but we want to do things slowly. Jonas and Annika talked about that earlier as well. So it's another tool in our toolbox to slow up that process and to create potential habitat. This is another type of environment. This is a beech plantation woodland that is extremely boring. All the trees are the same age exactly, and it's a perfect place for Vikki and arborists to play. Where do we not do it? I think this is pretty obvious. Avenues, landscape designed parks. Again, it's probably obvious, but sometimes it's just worth saying. So I want to tell you a little bit about a trial that Jonas and I and another guy, Mats Niklasson, worked together on in 2012. And we were a bit cocky, actually, at that time, that we said this trial was going to be 25 years. We had no money. We just had quite a lot of enthusiasm at the time. And we hoped to get 10 sites. And it's part of this was in the pub, talking about the fact that we had no good monitoring data for the trees that we'd been doing veteranization on in the UK. And we wanted to do something where actually it's not just expensive bird boxes that we're creating, that actually this is well worth using nature conservation money. We know how rare that money is, almost as rare as our red data book species. And we hope to get about 10 sites, but of course I felt some kind of, you know, sovereignty there, that I wanted to have some sites in the UK as well. So we got 3 sites in England, we've got 1 in Norway and 16 in Sweden. And that means we have almost 1,000 trees, which are all oak, that are included in this trial. These are the methods we used. We had some that we wanted to do, which were going to be quick fixes, if you like, and others that would take a longer time. Some that could be done from the ground and some that needed arborists to do the work. So this one on your left is the horse damage. We did a broken branch, ringbark branch, creating mimicking a woodpecker hole. And the other one is creating a larger cavity, like a nest box, I suppose, in a living tree, and the top was removed. So those 5 treatments were done over all 20 sites in 2012. We had 4 groups of arborists in these 3 countries doing the work within a 2 or 3 week period. So it was a lot of calibration and a lot of fun. I want to tell you a little bit about the results. But in addition to that, at the same time, I want to mention also Tinere, where we're going tomorrow, because Anders said, Vikki, do you fancy doing a veteranization plan for Tinere? And it was just like, this is a dream job. So we did another 300 trees in Tinere, but that one, we did that work from between 2011 up until 2015. And we've been back to look at those trees just last summer. And there we had a few more different ideas, so things like lightning strikes and flush cuts, which is like swearing in church if you're an arborist, using explosives, because Anders had a guy who worked for him for a few months who had one of those kind of licenses. We also did some pretty heavy duty pollarding, topping the trees as well. So the big question, does it work? My husband is also an ecologist, and he often kind of has said to me, Vikki, you're just making really expensive bird boxes. And, you know, there is that feeling like, you know, are we really doing that? Because a bird box you can knock together with school kids do it, don't they? But is that really the same equivalent to holes in old trees? My instinct says absolutely not. And I think we now know that that's really the case. So I'm going to very quickly whiz through some of the results. Some of these are published and some of them are not. We put up some window traps on the large trial in 2014, and we've been blown away by the results so far. Some of the analysis we've shown, we've got similar results to those that Niklas showed, about 500 odd species. We had double the number of wood-living species in the nest boxes and the woodpecker holes in comparison to the control trees. We had some interesting species, including those that Niklas has also mentioned. We also had more than 600 species of flies and bees and wasps, and a lot associated with sap runs, as you might expect. So some of the early ephemeral type habitats that you create when trees are first damaged. Fungi, of course, is the crucial part. We called some of these bird boxes and woodpecker holes, but actually they were more of a way in which we could get people's agreement to do the work, if you like. But it's fungi that's crucial here, their role in trees and the breakdown process. That's what brings in the other species later. So the university at SLU got some money, and they did some fungi sampling. And it was very fascinating, not least because we found about 300 species in each individual oak tree. That just blew me away. None of them were really the decay species that we were looking for. We did get some decay species, but mostly were endophytes. And there's been much, much more research that's come out with the same results, that actually trees are chock-a-block full of fungi, many, many more than the fruit bodies that we see, which is slightly depressing if you're a field biologist. Just to show you, this is actually published, so that's why I'm not going to say too much about it. But what this picture shows, you've seen some other cool diagrams this afternoon, is the green ones here are the controls, and this is the differences in the species. And the nest box and the woodpeckers, there's a lot of overlap, and the horse damage. And that makes sense to me, because this is where we damaged the sapwood. This is where we exposed the heartwood. And these are the trees that we didn't do any damage at all. So even after only 6 years, we're seeing a difference in the species composition. So this was like Christmas for me. I got a job to go out and look at these trees. I know, you know, I'm amongst fellow nerds here, I feel, so that's good. Get a ladder, go up and look at the trees, and every time you're going to open up the box and see what's inside was kind of, is there going to be a surprise today? This was a great photograph with a lesser spotted woodpecker on some of the what we call fracture cuts on the trees, and I've got one of these in my garden, not a lesser spotted woodpecker and an oak tree, and I've seen the same at home. So they clearly provide some interesting habitat for that species. So this, I'm going to run through some of the results from the larger trial here, as well as tell you a little about the results from Tinere. But these are all published in a report which is available in English as well. So if I'm going too fast, it's something that you can pick up later. Almost 70% of what we call the nest boxes were actually used for nesting and had been used over several years, which of course created material in the bottom of the boxes, which starts off this kind of wood mould or saprosylic humus, which is the new word I like, to kind of in the bottom of the cavities. We also had bats using these, and I've since been looking into this quite a lot about bats and the opportunity for creating habitat for bats, and apparently it's really flippin' difficult because they're very picky, and it's only the common species that use bat boxes. So that was really exciting. That's when I nearly fell off the ladder, when we found bats actually in the trees. Very few of the trees died, which I was also delighted about, because the intention was that these trees would stay alive. But one of the kind of, if you like, the side bits of information that we can gain by the size of this trial is actually some of the population dynamics in oaks of this kind of age. We actually have very little data about that. And very few of our control trees, in fact none of the control trees, had died over the course of 8 years. We also found wood mice. That was so exciting. I didn't expect to find wood mice 4 meters up in a tree, and we had 4 meters because that was the size of the ladder rather than because I was afraid of heights. We also found lots of tree ants, and I think that was probably for me one of the exciting results, because tree ants, I think as Niklas has already mentioned, have a pretty significant role in old tree and cavity ecology. And the fact they've come in means that we must be creating something that looks interesting for them. And in turn, I think they bring mycelium with them. And there are other species that then follow suit. So I was really excited by that as kind of, if you like, some kind of measure of the fact that these are mimicking some of the habitats we find in older trees. I guess it's obvious to think that the ones with the nest boxes grew less. We hit them pretty hard. We took the tops off and sawed out a giant hole in them, but they didn't really, many of them die. So that in itself shows you how vital these trees were. But we did also get decay. In 2014, there were very few of the trees that had any signs of decay, but we had almost 40% of the trees that had decay of some kind, mostly white rot, but we did have a few with the brown or the red rot. And I even found a fistulina fruiting body on a root coming from the side of the tree where we'd created a nest box. But then there were kind of other things that were a bit of a surprise, I suppose. The fact that the woodpecker holes we'd created had been chewed and gnawed by other species. And first of all, I just assumed it was woodpeckers. But then when we found the wood mice, I started to wonder, you know, maybe there's other things going on. And in America, they have a very clear connection between several mammals chewing the callus growth on trees to keep cavities open. So, you know, there's maybe a puzzle piece there that we don't really know about. Sap runs, Anders and I, when we talked about veteranization to begin with, sap runs are tricky to create on oaks. And we've managed to create them using the climbing spikes. That's where we found the most sap runs. They're relatively ephemeral though, and they appear to disappear relatively quickly after we've done the work. And a few quick results from Tinere. We had a few more trees that died, but I think I know why that is. We pollarded big trees that we shouldn't be pollarding, and a few drought years probably meant that that was just too tough for those trees. But we had more birds using the cavities at Tinere. More like 80% had used the cavities there. all half of the trees had some kind of decay as well. So that was also really exciting. 1,000 metres of new dead wood in the trees, actual lengths of dead wood that in the crown, mostly aerial, decaying wood. And creating 100 new different cavities. We drilled holes in the trees in those ones and created these kind of seams of decay, if you like. And there we also got sap runs. Also tree ants. I nearly got attacked by hornets. The sap runs we found were on the newer trees, so the more recently done trees than the older ones. And I think there were probably sap runs there before, but they've just kind of dried up because it's a tree defence mechanism, if you like. Just going to go whiz through a few final pictures here to see if this one works. No? Oh, yeah. No, okay. Well, you'll just have to believe me. It's a very poor quality film of some brown long-eared bats. About 6 of them in the bottom of one of the nest boxes. And this has really got the attention of the bat folks. They're very excited about the fact that we've found not just single individuals and of common species, but of some of the tree species. And this was what it was sitting inside. Here's another one with, this is from Tromte as well in Blekinge, where we've got a little bat hanging in there. We've also got nesting material. And I think this is one of the other things that's really interesting, is that cavities are being used by different species over space and time, both within, you know, over time that way, but in space in different parts of the cavity as well. This is the chewing, which is the mystery. So if someone's got loads of money and wants to give me a shed load of cameras, I'd like to put them up to see who's doing this. Because the other thing, I don't know if you can see from this photograph, is you've got exposed wood here, which shows that this has been happening on several occasions. So there's a culprit that's coming back. And these are teeth marks, I reckon, here. And this are mice. That's just for the awe. And these are some of the ground beetles using the sap runs. And these are kind of the other kinds of habitats that we didn't really anticipate, but you get these kind of lifting bark with a nice little space there, which we know bats like to use as well. Then we found some of the cavities full of fresh leaves in August, so far after the bird breeding season. No one can really explain what that is, but it could be the mice again. Then we've got bees, the bees that live in trees using them, then being parasitized as well. So there was all sorts of stuff happening in these after what I would say is a relatively short amount of time. So just to sum up, I feel pretty convinced that we're no longer just creating expensive bird boxes, that we are actually creating habitats that can complement the work we're doing. That hollows appear to be one of, I mean, we all know that lack of hollow trees and lack of hollows in our landscape is a major problem. Not just, you know, in Sweden, but everywhere that I go to look at old trees, that's what we're missing in the wider landscape. That succession of species is really interesting. I mean, you could have 5 PhD projects on this, couldn't you, really? Looking at what species are coming and going and when they're using it, and over time, just the fungi, never mind the tree ants and the mammals. So more work is needed, and even to be looking more specifically, for example, for bats, I think was very under-recorded, because obviously if there were bat droppings in one of the cavities, we wouldn't really have seen them always. And as a friend of mine who works with bats says, 9 times out of 10 that you look in a cavity that's used by a bat, the bat's not there. So it's also a bit depressing. So I've decided not to work with bats anymore. But I guess, you know, this may be stating the obvious, but it's a worry that I have actually with regard to veteranization, is that it can be seen as a way for developers to say, we'll just knock down that 400-year-old oak and we can knock up a few veteranized trees and we'll bring in Vikki and she'll sort us out. And it's like, no, thank you. But it really, you know, we can't replace what nature has spent 50 million years sorting out, can we, really? But on the other hand, as a nature conservation tool to help us, I think it really is worth the money in the right place. And as I said already, it's not appropriate everywhere. And we only really need to use this where we do have a generation gap and where we've got trees that are suitable for working on, because nature's still the best perpetrator of old trees and hollows. Just a quick thank you. Here we go. This is showing how nerdy I am. This is the cavity I've got at home with the little blue tit sticking out, and this is the red squirrel also in the same cavity. I've had 8 different species in this single cavity at home. So now I've only gone 1 minute over time, so it's not bad. So do you have any questions so I can breathe?